By the time Edward's grandfather, Johann, had passed away, his eyes had taken on both a glassy sheen and a shocked look. The old man had borne a lot: wartime injuries, captivity and malnourishment, the loss of a business, some car crashes, and finally, his wife's declining mental health. He bled really badly when he hit his forehead going into the cellar one morning. He wanted his garden shears to prune the rose bushes for spring. The last time I saw him in the hospital, he still had a triangular scab where the skin had scraped away, Edward was telling Janet. He was following her down the sidewalk outside the theater. A cold wind blew red, yellow, and orange leaves off the trees in the park across the street, and the sun burned adamantly in the cloudless sky. She slowed and put her hand on his arm, sliding it down to his hand before kissing him on the mouth. "I'm sorry," she said. "The thing I remember when I was with him was being in the presence of history and part of something lasting. Now that he's gone, I feel that all of that is too." They stopped at the loading dock, going inside through the cluttered backstage area and coming out on the stage. With the spotlights turned up, the house beyond seemed a monolithic black pool. Edward looked over and studied her profile. A wisp of her dark hair was illuminated in the intense light, and her high cheekbone cast a slight shadow on her olive skin. Suddenly, the light on her face dipped and they both glanced towards the booth, where the technician called out to them. The house lights were brought up as the rest of the cast arrived, and everyone went to the dressing room. Sitting and waiting to have his makeup done, Edward smelled the sweat and mustiness from the costumes. He could hear muffled chatter growing dense as the audience gathered. In the first act, Edward played a youthful iteration of his character and felt the dynamic between himself and Janet, playing his newly pregnant wife, struck a chord. The scenario of their starting a family together opened in him a palpable excitement. She filled his narrow field of vision with her outpouring of emotion. By the second act, they were standing in the barren living room of their house, surrounded by sealed moving boxes. Edward had let his muscles go slack so his belly would protrude and his posture would sag. Moving around the stage gingerly, he simulated a man late in middle age, being cautious with his increasingly fragile body. He told himself that the boxed items, though in good condition and imbued with historical significance, would give him less joy than when they were new, stylish, and beckoning the young couple towards their lifetime ahead. "That's the lot of it," Janet was telling him in character as she bustled around with her feather duster. "Every single item we've collected in almost 30 years of marriage, packed up in boxes, just like that. Can you believe it?" "Hardly," Edward told her, trying to focus on his own character. He couldn't quite shake from his mind what Janet had promised him for after the show. Every time he'd finished delivering a line, he thought again of finally getting past that final layer of her clothing. He'd been yearning for her, hoping she would offer him a chance, but also anxious to halt the progression of his attraction. In the past year, his habit had become to resist any experience that would change him. Already, Johann, who had given Edward both instruction and closeness, was a memory stopped in time that he guarded in the deepest recesses of his mind where it felt safe. Every new experience he had moved him a bit farther from that day in early spring when the old man lay withered in the hospital bed and lost his life. He felt himself becoming a stranger to the memory of a person who had once been his companion. The lights came down, and the stagehand wheeled out a hospital bed for the next scene. "Where's your mind at?" Janet whispered as they changed costumes backstage. "You weren't this distracted during the rehearsal. Are you nervous?" Edward stuck his arms through the sleeves of a surgical gown. "Am I doing badly?" "No, but it feels like you're distant." Climbing into the hospital bed, Edward covered himself with a blanket. A single beam of light, dim at first, and then rising to full intensity, left him in an island of brightness. Janet joined him there for the final scene of the play, her face so close that he felt the warmth and humidity of her breath. Having had an operation in which a tumor was cut from his flesh, his character had just been told that the biopsy indicated cancer. For a moment, Edward felt trapped in an unpleasant sensation, as though he were facing his own death. His brief life had thus far carried little burden of disappointment, but the character he was playing had suffered through chronic health problems, unemployment, and fallen far short of his dreams. What if he, Edward, began to suffer in a similar way? He wouldn't know how to live, limping from crisis to crisis towards an anticlimactic end. There's a mistake, Janet was pleading in character. There must be, because sharing life with you has been the most blessed experience. We have never failed to overcome an obstacle. God, I wish I could say different words, but there is no mistake. My world is going to shrink and dwindle away to nothing, and this is where we part ways. I don't know how else to put it. When the show ended, the audience broke out clapping, and whistles reached the actors lining up for their bow. With his sweating hand in Janet's, Edward felt his blood tinged with adrenaline. The audience stopped short of a standing ovation, although their applause continued long enough for several bows before the heavy red velvet curtain glided shut. Backstage, the cast passed around a bottle of vodka someone had brought and began quickly to get drunk as they reveled in elation and congratulated one another. With the bottle mostly empty, one group left for a late-night dinner, another to a party. Edward and Janet, both giddy, went back to his apartment together. I almost felt there at the end of the play things would end differently than we rehearsed it, that you might switch and convince me to take the chemotherapy and that our life could continue. You made me want to go off the script, Edward was saying as he took a bottle of Pinot Noir from the top of the refrigerator and rummaged through the drawers for a corkscrew. They took big gulps of the wine, and she let him grab her breasts and ass hungrily as he grappled to remove her clothes, hurriedly pulling off his own. At the lustrous, hyper-real sight of her naked body, he wavered in his determination, felt suddenly as if he'd advanced too far and crossed into unstable terrain. With their bodies merged, she uttered a drawn-out moan, but it seemed to him to lack the swelling, urgent foundation that he'd anticipated. Physically, he did nothing. If she was keeping a barrier in between them, then he empathized. He feared the emotional changes that attachment makes to the foundation of a person. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing." His face was hovering directly above hers, making it uncomfortable to avoid eye contact. "Well, if you're just going to lay there, then get off me." He did so, and he sat next to her, still excited, still pulsing with energy, still erect. "I'm sorry." "Is it because of the play?" "Because I'm a professional, and I can tell you for sure that it wouldn't change our dynamic on stage. At least, nothing would change on my end. Maybe I'm not so confident about my own reaction." "That sounds to me like an excuse, but okay." Janet stepped out of bed. She switched on the hard fluorescent light in the kitchen, and her vertebrae jutted from her arched back as she bent to pull up her panties. "I can bet you're embarrassed, but I'm not mad. Just don't act weird on stage tomorrow night." "I won't," Edward said. He watched her get dressed and tie her shoes. "How should I act?" "Just act like it never happened." She exited the apartment.